Looking past the lens and venturing across borders, we capture the enduring essence of human resilience. Join us on a professional journey to witness the monumental events that changed the world forever.
License and registration.
Officer, we're transporting a critical cardiac arrest patient. We need to get to the hospital right now.
Clock you doing 78 and a 65.
We're an emergency vehicle in active transport. We're allowed to exceed the speed limit. Sir, every second counts for our patients.
You're transporting a white woman. All of you in this ambulance are black.
What does that
Georgia State Patrol Officer Wade Holloway was working traffic enforcement on Interstate 285 near the Cascade Road exit in southwest Atlanta on the afternoon of September 21st, 2024, when he clocked an ambulance doing 78 miles per hour in a 65 zone and decided to pull it over despite its emergency lights and sirens. He looked through the windshield, saw 3 black paramedics with an unconscious white woman in the back, and his racist mind couldn't process any scenario where that was legitimate. So he detained them on the highway shoulder and accused them of kidnapping while their patient was actively dying. What Officer Holloway didn't know, as he ignored their desperate pleas to let them continue to the hospital, was that the woman losing her life in the back of that ambulance was Sandra Hayes, that her husband Raymond was a retired Atlanta Fire Department battalion chief with enough connections to ensure this stop would be investigated at the highest levels, and that his 8-minute detention would cost Sandra her life, cost him his freedom, and result in an $18 million verdict that would bankrupt him completely. This story is going to make you furious. Hit that like button and subscribe to Brutal Bad Stories, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Interstate 285 circles Atlanta like a concrete belt, carrying hundreds of thousands of vehicles every day through a perpetual rotation of traffic that ranges from moderate to nightmarish, depending on the hour. The Cascade Road exit sits in the southwest quadrant, where the highway cuts through residential neighborhoods, past shopping centers and churches, serving communities that have been part of Atlanta's fabric for generations. On a Saturday afternoon in September, traffic was moderate, moving at highway speeds, when the 911 call came in at 2:47 p.m. The call was from a neighbor on Cascade Heights Drive who'd heard screaming from the house next door. She'd run over and found Sandra Hayes, 58 years old, collapsed in her kitchen, clutching her chest, while her husband Raymond tried to keep her conscious and breathing. Raymond had immediately started CPR while the neighbor called for help. The dispatcher sent the closest available unit, which happened to be stationed less than 2 miles away. The ambulance that responded belonged to Grady EMS, Atlanta's primary emergency medical service. The crew on duty that Saturday was Marcus Reed, 34 years old, an experienced paramedic who'd been with Grady for 9 years and had responded to thousands of calls across the city. In the back with the medical equipment was Keisha Thompson, 41, the lead paramedic and a 17-year veteran who'd seen every kind of emergency Atlanta could produce. The third crew member was Nicole Davis, 28, a newer paramedic but fully trained and certified, riding along to assist with whatever the call required. All 3 of them were black. This detail shouldn't have mattered. It had nothing to do with their training, their experience, their ability to save lives. But it would matter to Officer Wade Holloway in ways that would cost Sandra Hayes everything. The ambulance arrived at the Hayes residence at 2:50 p.m., 3 minutes after the call. They found Sandra in full cardiac arrest. Raymond, who'd been a battalion chief with Atlanta Fire for 26 years before retiring, had kept her alive with CPR, but she was in critical condition and deteriorating fast. Keisha immediately took over compressions while Marcus got the stretcher, and Nicole prepared medications and the defibrillator. They worked with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times before. Within 4 minutes, they had Sandra loaded, an IV line started, medications administered, and were pulling away from the house with lights and sirens. Raymond climbed into the front passenger seat, his face showing the terror of watching his wife die and the desperate hope that these paramedics could save her. "Grady Memorial, 10 minutes out," Marcus said into the radio, his voice calm and professional despite the urgency. "Female, 58, full cardiac arrest, CPR in progress, 1 defibrillation administered on scene." In the back, Keisha was working on Sandra with absolute focus. Nicole had the monitors showing Sandra's heart rhythm, which was erratic and dangerous. They'd shocked her once at the house to try to restore normal rhythm, but it hadn't held, She was slipping away and they needed to get her to the hospital fast. Marcus accelerated onto I-285 heading east toward Grady Memorial Hospital on Jesse Hill Jr. Drive in downtown Atlanta. With lights and sirens, the trip should take about 12 minutes. Traffic was moderate but moving, and cars were pulling over to let them pass as required by law. Marcus pushed the ambulance to 78 miles per hour in the 65 zone, which was completely appropriate for an emergency vehicle responding to a life-threatening situation. That's when Officer Wade Holloway, sitting in his patrol car monitoring traffic speeds from the shoulder near Cascade Road, clocked them and decided to pull them over. Holloway had been with Georgia State Patrol for 11 years. He was 43 years old, white, with a reputation among other troopers for being overly aggressive and writing tickets for violations that most officers would have let slide. He'd received 6 complaints over his career, 3 of them alleging racial bias in his enforcement decisions. All had been dismissed or resulted in minor disciplinary actions that never appeared in his official record. When his radar showed the ambulance doing 78, his first instinct was to let it go. Emergency vehicles were exempt from speed limits when responding to calls. But then he looked at the ambulance as it passed and something triggered his suspicion. He pulled out behind them, activated his lights and signaled for them to stop. Marcus saw the flashing lights in his mirror and couldn't believe what he was seeing. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "He's pulling us over." Raymond turned around to look. "Don't stop. We've got emergency lights. You're exempt." "I know," Marcus said, "but if I don't stop, he might call it in as fleeing, and that creates a whole mess." He started slowing down and moving toward the shoulder. In the back, Keisha looked up from Sandra's chest where she was performing compressions. "Why are we stopping?" she called out. "State Patrol pulled us over," Nicole said, disbelief in her voice. "We're running a code," Keisha said. "We can't stop." But Marcus was already pulling onto the shoulder because he knew that arguing with a cop on the highway was a losing proposition. He put the ambulance in park but left the emergency lights running. Raymond was already pulling out his phone to document what was happening. Holloway got out of his patrol car and walked up to the driver's side window. Marcus rolled it down. "Do you know how fast you were going?" Holloway asked. Marcus stared at him. "We're running an emergency call. We've got a patient in cardiac arrest in the back. We're exempt from speed limits under Georgia law." "Let me see your license and registration," Holloway said, ignoring the explanation completely. "Officer, we have a woman dying in the back of this ambulance," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "We need to get her to Grady Memorial right now. You can follow us if you want to verify the emergency, but we cannot sit here." Holloway walked past the driver's window toward the back of the ambulance. He looked through the rear windows and saw Keisha performing chest compressions on Sandra, saw Nicole monitoring equipment, saw an unconscious white woman with 3 black paramedics working on her. His expression changed. He came back to Marcus's window with something new in his face. Suspicion, accusation. "Who's the patient?" Holloway demanded. "A woman in cardiac arrest," Marcus said. "Officer, please, we're losing time." "How do I know this is a legitimate call?" Holloway interrupted. "How do I know you didn't just pick up someone without authorization?" Marcus's mouth fell open. "Are you serious? We're Grady EMS. We responded to a 911 call. Dispatch can verify everything, but we need to go now." "I need to verify this situation," Holloway said. He keyed his radio. "This is Unit 47. I've got an ambulance stopped on 285 near Cascade. I need to verify they have authorization for the patient they're transporting." In the front seat, Raymond was staring at Holloway with growing horror. "Officer, that's my wife in the back. I called 911. These paramedics are trying to save her life. Let them go." Holloway looked at Raymond like he was trying to determine if this was part of some elaborate deception. In the back of the ambulance, Sandra's heart rhythm was getting worse. "Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe that emergency responders should never be stopped while saving lives, then hit that like and subscribe button and join the JPTV family." Keisha was still doing chest compressions on Sandra, sweat already forming on her forehead from the physical exertion. She'd been doing compressions for almost 6 minutes straight now between the house and the ambulance, and her arms were starting to burn, but she couldn't stop. Every second without effective circulation meant Sandra's brain was being deprived of oxygen. "Marcus, we need to move," Keisha shouted toward the front. "Her rhythm is deteriorating." Nicole was watching the monitor with growing alarm. Sandra's heart was in ventricular fibrillation, a chaotic rhythm that meant the heart was quivering instead of pumping blood effectively. They'd already administered medications, already shocked her once, but nothing was working because they were sitting on the side of a highway instead of getting her to a hospital where she could receive definitive care. Marcus leaned out the window. "Officer, our patient is in VFib. She's dying right now. We have to transport her immediately. You can follow us, you can meet us at the hospital, you can verify everything once she's stable. But we cannot sit here." "I said I need to verify this situation," Holloway repeated stubbornly. "You'll wait until I get confirmation from dispatch." "Confirmation of what?" Marcus's voice was rising now, desperation breaking through his professional composure. "We're a Grady ambulance with emergency lights running, transporting a cardiac arrest patient. What exactly do you think we're doing?" Holloway's face hardened. "I think I've got 3 individuals transporting an unconscious white woman, and I'm not letting you go anywhere until I confirm you have legal authority to have her in this vehicle." The words hung in the air like poison. Raymond stared at Holloway with absolute disbelief. "You think we kidnapped her?" Raymond said, his voice shaking. "You think 3 licensed paramedics in a city ambulance kidnapped my wife?" "I'm verifying the situation," Holloway said again. "That is the situation," Raymond shouted. "I'm a retired battalion chief with Atlanta Fire. I called 911. These paramedics responded. My wife is dying while you stand here accusing them of kidnapping." Holloway's radio crackled. "Unit 47 dispatch. What's your location and status?" "I'm on 285 near Cascade with an ambulance. I need verification on a 911 call for a cardiac arrest patient, female, approximately 58 years old. Pickup location, Cascade Heights Drive." There was a pause. "Unit 47, we show that call dispatched to Grady EMS at 2:47. Ambulance arrived on scene at 2:50. Departed at 2:54 with patient en route to Grady Memorial. That's a confirmed emergency transport." Holloway's face showed he'd heard the confirmation, but he didn't immediately respond. He stood there for another moment, like he was trying to decide whether to believe his own dispatch. In the back, Nicole called out, "Keisha, she's losing her rhythm completely." Keisha looked at the monitor and her heart sank. Sandra's heart was starting to show periods where it wasn't beating at all, just flat lines between the chaotic fibrillation. "We need to shock her again. Marcus, we have to go." Marcus turned back to Holloway. "Officer, dispatch just confirmed we're on a legitimate call. Our patient is crashing. If you don't let us go right now, she's going to die on this highway." Holloway still didn't move. He was looking at Raymond, at Marcus, like he was trying to reconcile what dispatch had told him with what his prejudices were telling him. "Officer," Raymond was out of the passenger seat now, standing on the shoulder. "My wife has been sitting here for over 7 minutes. Every second counts. Let them go." Nicole had the defibrillator charged. "Keisha, clear!" Keisha lifted her hands off Sandra's chest. Nicole delivered the shock. Sandra's body jerked on the stretcher. They all watched the monitor, hoping to see a normal rhythm return. It didn't. The heart went back to the same dangerous pattern. "Resume compressions," Nicole said, and Keisha went back to pushing on Sandra's chest, trying to manually pump blood through her body because her heart couldn't do it on its own. The time display on the ambulance dashboard showed 3:02 p.m. They'd been stopped for 8 minutes. 8 minutes that Sandra didn't have. Marcus looked at Holloway with fury in his eyes. "You just heard dispatch confirm this is a legitimate emergency call. You can see we're working on a patient. You can see her husband standing right here. What more do you need?" Holloway's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he didn't want to say. Finally, he stepped back from the ambulance. "You can go." Marcus didn't wait for him to change his mind. He put the ambulance in gear and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating hard toward Grady Memorial. Behind them, Holloway stood on the shoulder watching them go. In the back, Keisha was still doing compressions, but her face showed she knew they'd lost critical time. Sandra had been in cardiac arrest for over 15 minutes now. The first few minutes had been at her house with Raymond doing CPR. Then they'd gotten her in the ambulance and been making progress toward the hospital. And then they'd sat on the highway for 8 minutes while a state trooper verified that black paramedics were allowed to transport a white patient. "How far out?" Keisha called to Marcus. 4 minutes, Marcus said, pushing the ambulance as fast as he dared. Nicole was administering more medications, trying everything in their protocol to restart Sandra's heart. But nothing was working. The monitor showed a heart that was giving up. Raymond was in the front seat with his hands pressed against his face, tears running down his cheeks. He'd been a first responder for 26 years. He'd seen hundreds of cardiac arrests. He knew what the chances were after this much time. He knew what those 8 minutes had cost. They pulled up to Grady Memorial's emergency entrance at 3:06 p.m. The ER team was waiting, alerted by radio about the incoming critical patient. They got Sandra out of the ambulance and into a trauma bay in seconds. Keisha gave her report to the ER doctor while continuing chest compressions. Sandra Hayes, 58, witnessed cardiac arrest at home. Husband initiated CPR immediately. We arrived 3 minutes after the call, found her in VFib, shocked once on scene, got her loaded and started transport. We were stopped by State Patrol on 285 for 8 minutes. We've been doing CPR the entire time, multiple shocks, full ACLS protocol, no return of spontaneous circulation. The ER doctor's face showed exactly what he thought about being stopped for 8 minutes during a cardiac arrest transport, but he didn't say anything. He just took over the resuscitation effort. They worked on Sandra for another 41 minutes. They shocked her 6 more times. They pushed every medication available. They tried everything modern medicine had to offer. At 3:47 p.m., the ER doctor looked at the monitor, looked at the flat line that showed a heart that had finally given up completely, and called the time of death. Raymond Hayes stood in the trauma bay and watched them pull the sheet over his wife's face. The woman he'd been married to for 33 years, the mother of his 2 children, the person he'd spent more than half his life with. Gone. Marcus, Keisha, and Nicole stood outside the trauma bay in silence. They'd done everything right. They'd responded fast, worked efficiently, provided excellent care, and a state trooper had stopped them on the highway and forced them to sit there while their patient died. The ER doctor came out and pulled Marcus aside. "I'm writing in my report that the 8-minute delay on the highway was a significant factor in the patient's death. She might not have made it anyway, but those 8 minutes took away any chance she had." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Raymond came out of the trauma bay. He walked past the paramedics without saying anything, his face showing he was in shock. But then he stopped and turned back. "This wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "You did everything you could. This was that trooper, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he did." Raymond Hayes made the first call from the hospital parking lot while he was still trying to process that his wife was dead. He called his son, told him to come to Grady immediately. Then he called his former captain at Atlanta Fire Department, a man he'd worked with for 15 years who was now a deputy fire chief. He told him what happened, his voice shaking with grief and rage. "A state trooper stopped the ambulance," Raymond said, "for 8 minutes, while Sandra was in cardiac arrest. The ER doctor said the delay was a significant factor in her death." The deputy chief was silent for a long moment. "Raymond, I'm so sorry, and I'm going to make some calls. This needs to be investigated immediately." The deputy chief called the Georgia State Patrol Command, who called their Internal Affairs Division, who started pulling records on the stop. By the time Wade Holloway finished his shift that evening, his supervisor was already reviewing the incident and the dashboard camera footage from his patrol car. The footage showed everything: Holloway clocking the ambulance and pulling them over despite their emergency lights and sirens. The conversation where Marcus explained that they had a cardiac arrest patient. Holloway walking to the back and looking through the windows at the 3 black paramedics working on the unconscious white woman. His radio call asking to verify they had authorization for the patient. Dispatch confirming it was a legitimate 911 call. and then Holloway standing there for another full minute before finally letting them go. 8 minutes and 12 seconds from when he'd stopped them to when he'd let them leave, all captured on video with timestamps. The Georgia State Patrol opened an investigation the next morning, but Raymond wasn't waiting for internal processes. He contacted an attorney named Victoria Cross, one of Atlanta's most aggressive civil rights lawyers. He gave her the ER doctor's report, the paramedics' documentation, and the timeline showing exactly how long Holloway had detained them. Victoria filed a complaint with the Department of Justice within 72 hours. She also contacted every major news outlet in Atlanta and gave them the story. By Tuesday, it was the lead story on every local news station. State trooper stops ambulance, patient dies, ran across television screens throughout Georgia. The dashboard camera footage was released to the media. People watched in horror as Holloway stopped an ambulance with lights and sirens, questioned whether black paramedics were authorized to transport a white patient, and forced them to wait on the highway while dispatch confirmed what should have been obvious. Social media exploded with outrage. Georgia State Patrol placed Holloway on administrative leave pending the investigation. The investigation took 3 weeks. The findings were damning beyond anything the agency had anticipated. Holloway had no legal basis to stop the ambulance. Emergency vehicles responding to calls are exempt from speed limits under Georgia law. Even if he'd had questions, protocol required him to either follow the ambulance to verify at the hospital or contact dispatch immediately, not detain them on the highway. His radio call asking to verify authorization showed racial bias, as he'd assumed the black paramedics must have done something wrong, despite their uniforms, their marked ambulance, and their emergency lights. Most damning was the medical examiner's report on Sandra's death. The examiner stated clearly that while Sandra had suffered a massive heart attack and might not have survived regardless, the 8-minute delay in reaching the hospital was a significant contributing factor to the patient's death. Those 8 minutes had eliminated any chance she had. Holloway was fired 3 weeks after the incident. The termination letter cited gross negligence, racial profiling, failure to follow emergency vehicle protocols, and conduct that resulted in civilian death. His law enforcement certification was revoked. He would never work as a police officer again anywhere in Georgia. But termination wasn't enough for what he'd done. The Fulton County District Attorney reviewed the case and filed criminal charges: involuntary manslaughter, official misconduct, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The DA's office released a statement saying that Holloway's actions had directly contributed to Sandra Hayes' death and that he would face the full consequences. The criminal trial took place 7 months later. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They showed the dashboard camera footage of the stop. They played the 911 call from Sandra's neighbor and the dispatch recordings. They brought in the ER doctor who testified about Sandra's condition and how the delay had affected her chances. They brought in Keisha, Marcus, and Nicole, who described performing CPR on a dying woman while a state trooper questioned whether they were authorized to help her. Raymond testified about watching his wife die, about knowing that those 8 minutes on the highway had stolen any chance she had to survive. He testified about being a 26-year veteran of Atlanta Fire Department, about understanding emergency response protocols, about knowing that what Holloway did violated every standard of professional conduct. The medical examiner testified that Sandra's heart attack had been severe and that her chances of survival had been low regardless. But he stated unequivocally that the 8-minute delay had been a significant contributing factor to her death, and that without that delay, she might have received treatment in time to save her life. The defense tried to argue that Holloway had been following procedures to verify the legitimacy of the ambulance transport. The prosecution destroyed that argument by bringing in Georgia State Patrol training supervisors who testified that nothing in their protocols authorized stopping an emergency vehicle during active patient transport, and that Holloway's actions violated every rule they taught. The prosecution also revealed Holloway's history: 6 previous complaints alleging racial bias in traffic stops. 3 involved black drivers in expensive cars who he'd questioned about vehicle ownership. 2 involved black pedestrians he'd stopped and questioned without cause. All had been dismissed with minimal investigation. The pattern was clear and undeniable. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They found Holloway guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in state prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 4 years. The civil lawsuit Raymond filed was separate and even more devastating. Victoria Cross sued Holloway personally and the Georgia State Patrol for wrongful death, deprivation of rights, and gross negligence. The suit sought $18 million in damages. The trial showed the jury everything: the dashboard footage of Holloway stopping the ambulance and detaining them while Sandra died, the radio traffic where he questioned whether black paramedics were authorized to transport a patient, the medical evidence showing the delay had killed Sandra's chances, Raymond's testimony about losing his wife because a racist cop couldn't imagine that black people were actually helping instead of committing a crime. The jury awarded the full $18 million. Holloway was personally liable for $3 million. The Georgia State Patrol was liable for $15 million. Holloway didn't have $3 million. He had a modest house and a truck. He filed for bankruptcy immediately, but the judgment would follow him for life. Wade Holloway served 4 years in state prison before being released on parole. He was 47 years old when he walked out, with a felony conviction and a $3 million judgment hanging over him that bankruptcy couldn't erase. He couldn't work in law enforcement anywhere. Background checks eliminated most employment opportunities. He ended up working night shifts stocking shelves at a grocery store in Macon, Georgia, making $13 an hour and living in the efficiency apartment he could barely afford. Every night he stocked shelves, he thought about those 8 minutes. 8 minutes that had cost Sandra Hayes her life. 8 minutes that had destroyed his career, his freedom, his future. 8 minutes that had happened because he'd looked into an ambulance, seen 3 black paramedics with a white patient, and let his racism override every bit of training and common sense he'd ever received. The Georgia State Patrol paid the $15 million settlement and underwent a complete overhaul of their policies and training. The new protocols were named the Sandra Hayes Emergency Vehicle Protocols and were implemented statewide within 6 months of her death. The protocols were comprehensive and unambiguous. Officers were explicitly prohibited from stopping emergency vehicles with active patients, except in cases of immediate public safety threats. Any questions about the legitimacy of emergency transports had to be verified by following the vehicle to its destination or contacting dispatch immediately, never by detaining the vehicle. All officers received mandatory training on these protocols twice a year, and violations resulted in immediate termination. The training program included the dashboard camera footage from Holloway's stop. Every state trooper in Georgia was required to watch Sandra Hayes die because an officer had profiled paramedics based on race. The video became one of the most powerful teaching tools the agency had ever used. A stark reminder of what happened when bias replaced judgment. Raymond Hayes never recovered from losing Sandra. His children tried to help him through the grief, but he struggled with depression and survivor's guilt. He'd been a first responder his entire adult life, had saved countless lives, but couldn't save his own wife because a state trooper had stopped the people trying to help her. He used a significant portion of the settlement to establish the Sandra Hayes Foundation, dedicated to improving emergency medical response in underserved communities and advocating for policies that protected emergency responders from interference. The foundation funded scholarships for paramedics and EMTs, provided equipment to underfunded EMS services, and lobbied for legislation protecting emergency vehicles from unnecessary stops. The foundation also became a powerful voice for addressing racism in law enforcement. Raymond spoke at police academies, city council meetings, and community forums about what happened to Sandra. He showed the dashboard camera footage and asked one simple question: would this officer have stopped that ambulance if the paramedics had been white? Everyone who heard him speak knew the answer. Marcus Reed, Keisha Thompson, and Nicole Davis all continued working as paramedics for Grady EMS, but the incident changed them permanently. They'd done everything right that day, provided excellent care under terrible circumstances, and still watched their patient die because someone with a badge had decided their skin color made them suspicious. Marcus became an advocate for protecting EMS personnel from law enforcement interference. He testified before the Georgia legislature in support of stronger protections for emergency vehicles. He spoke at paramedic conferences about the incident and urged his colleagues to document everything when they were stopped or questioned, because their documentation might be the only thing that held officers accountable. Keisha suffered from PTSD after Sandra's death. She kept replaying those 8 minutes in her mind, wondering if there was anything she could have done differently. Her therapist eventually helped her understand that she'd done everything possible, that Sandra's death wasn't her failure, but Holloway's crime. She stayed in emergency medicine because she knew the work mattered, but she carried the weight of that day with her always. Nicole transferred to a different EMS service 6 months after the incident. She couldn't drive past that stretch of I-285 without reliving it, and Grady's service area required her to work that highway regularly. She moved to a suburban service where she could continue helping people without constant reminders of watching someone die unnecessarily. The ER doctor who treated Sandra and documented that the delay had contributed to her death became a vocal critic of law enforcement interference with medical care. He published an article in a major medical journal about the case, arguing that emergency medical personnel needed stronger legal protections from police who didn't understand or respect their work. The article was widely cited and helped drive policy changes across multiple states. Atlanta Fire Department held a memorial service for Sandra 6 months after her death. Hundreds of firefighters, paramedics, and first responders attended to honor her memory and support Raymond. The fire chief spoke about how Sandra's death had exposed a dangerous problem and how the protocols named after her would save lives in the future. But everyone there understood that those future lives couldn't bring Sandra back. The criminal trial and civil lawsuit became landmark cases studied in law schools and police academies across the country. Legal scholars wrote about the case as an example of how racial profiling could lead to manslaughter charges when it interfered with emergency medical care. The case established important precedents about law enforcement liability when officers stopped emergency vehicles without justification. The Georgia legislature passed the Sandra Hayes Emergency Response Protection Act 2 years after her death. The law created criminal penalties for anyone who interfered with emergency medical personnel during patient care, made it easier to sue officers who stopped emergency vehicles without cause, and required annual training on emergency vehicle protocols for all law enforcement in the state. Raymond attended the signing ceremony and accepted a copy of the law that bore his wife's name. The dashboard camera footage from Holloway's patrol car remained one of the most viewed pieces of evidence in law enforcement training nationwide. Agencies from across the country requested copies to use in their own training programs. The 8 minutes and 12 seconds of video became a powerful teaching tool about the deadly consequences of racial profiling. Sandra Hayes had been a retired elementary school teacher, a grandmother of 4, and someone who'd spent her life helping children learn and grow. She died on the side of a highway because a state trooper looked at the people trying to save her and saw their skin color before he saw their uniforms, their ambulance, or their desperate attempts to keep her alive. Raymond kept a photograph on his mantle of Sandra from their 30th wedding anniversary, 3 years before she died. In the photo, she was smiling, happy, full of life. Next to it, he kept a copy of the protocols that bore her name, a reminder that her death had forced changes that would protect others. But late at night when he was alone, he thought about those 8 minutes. 8 minutes where Sandra had been alive in the back of an ambulance with skilled paramedics fighting to save her. 8 minutes that a racist cop had stolen from her because he couldn't imagine black paramedics legitimately helping a white woman. 8 minutes that had taken away any chance she had. Wade Holloway thought about those 8 minutes too, every single day. He thought about them while stocking shelves in Macon. He thought about them while living in his tiny apartment with the judgment he'd never be able to pay. He thought about them knowing that his name would forever be attached to a woman's death, to protocols designed to prevent other officers from making his mistake, to a case study in how racism and a badge could turn into manslaughter. 8 minutes and 12 seconds. That's how long it took to destroy 2 lives completely and damage many others. One life ended on a hospital table, the other ended in a prison cell, and all of it was captured on dashboard camera, preserved forever as a warning about what happens when prejudice is given authority over life and death. When officers stop ambulances because they can't believe black paramedics are saving lives, the consequences must be devastating. If this story showed you why emergency responders deserve protection and why racism in uniform kills, share it everywhere. Subscribe to JPTV because we're exposing the deadly cost of prejudice and power, one tragic case at a time.
Physical evidence and forgotten records do not simply exist in a vacuum. They vividly recount the stories of those who came before us. Finding the objective truth within them is our highest professional duty. Thank you for standing beside us as we carefully unravel these mysteries.